Keynesian economics grows out of the Great Depression and our inability to explain how an economy could get stuck in such a recession, and how, if we are in such a recession, how do we get out of it? And so far, we've tackled the idea of how do we end up stuck in such a depression. And now what we're going to focus on is how could we get out of such a recession? And we'll focus on what's called Keynesian fiscal policy. So we've explained how we can end up in such a recession. Thanks to animal spirits, we could have drops in C and I, and thanks to the multiplier effect, it can make those drops feel even stronger in terms of aggregate demand and output. Thus, what do we have to do? We can do a Keynesian solution. Why don't we just offset the drop in C and I with an increase in G? This will be the primary approach to what we call Keynesian fiscal policy. But there's more to it than that, so let's dive in deeper. Fiscal policy is using the federal budget as a tool to help guide the macroeconomy. Fiscal policy is the deliberate changes in government spending and/or taxes designed to affect the size of the budget deficit or surplus in order to guide the output of our country. The federal budget is the primary tool of fiscal policy. To understand how fiscal policy works, we have to look at the federal budget deficit and surplus. So the basic idea or the basic definitions here are that when government spending is greater than government revenue, we have a deficit. We are spending more than we are bringing in. So in essence, we could say when government spending or expenditures are greater than the tax revenue that we have, the government revenue that's coming in, we have a deficit. And then likewise, if government spending is less than government revenue, then we have a surplus. When the spending is less than what we're bringing in, hey, we're bringing in more than what we actually need, we have a surplus in this situation. A budget surplus is present when the total government spending is less than the total revenue. Surpluses reduce the magnitude of the government's outstanding debt. Budget deficits are present when total government spending exceeds total revenue from all sources. When the money supply is constant, deficits must be covered with borrowing. The U.S. Treasury borrows by issuing bonds, so the Treasury is what issues bonds. Think of yourself, for example. If you're spending more than you have, you must borrow. How does the United States Treasury borrow? The United States Treasury borrows by issuing bonds. People pay for these bonds so that the U.S. government now has more money. People pay for the bonds because the government pays them back with interest at a later date. So this way, the government can pay for its expenditures now and pay off the interest in the future. If we look at deficit changes, there's really two sources. Changes in the size of a budget deficit, or even really in the size of its surplus, may arise from either a change in the state of the economy or a change in what's called discretionary fiscal policy. We are using our discretion to decide to change the budget deficit or surplus in order to steer the macroeconomy. We're engaging in fiscal policy. So we can either have a change in the state of the economy, just kind of natural, it's out there, the economy has some things changing, and that changes the size of the surplus or deficit. Or we could do it on purpose is the second way. It's a change in discretionary fiscal policy. We do it on purpose. We'll focus mostly on changes from fiscal policy, the ones where we're doing it on purpose to try and correct the macroeconomy. But you should know that changes in the size of the deficit or surplus can come from changes of the state of the economy all on its own. For example, during a recession, tax revenue generally falls. Right? So the revenue coming in usually falls during a recession. If we have an income tax and people are earning less income, well, there's going to be less income tax revenue. Right? Also during a recession, programs like welfare, unemployment benefits, things like that, they generally tend to rise. The increase in expenditures from this, along with the decrease in tax revenue, leads us more in the direction of a deficit. So you can see that the natural economy can lead us into a deficit or surplus. That's not really going to be our focus though. Our focus is, are we going to do extra spending or extra taxation in order to change or manipulate the budget? That is fiscal policy. Discretionary changes in fiscal policy are deliberate changes in government spending that we decide to do with our own discretion. If we're changing the size of government spending and or taxes in order to affect the size of the budget, deficit or surplus, then we're engaging in fiscal policy. Go to a deficit to expand the economy, increase spending in some way to move aggregate demand out. That's what that's all about. Or we could go towards a surplus to kind of pull back the economy, decrease our spending in some way to move aggregate demand back in. So if we look at this in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, what we have to do is we have to say, okay, well, let's look at the Keynesian model here. We might be at an equilibrium below full employment. We might be at an equilibrium Y1. What could we do if we were in this situation? Well, we could increase G and bump aggregate demand out. The aim would be to return the economy back to a level of full employment, right? We could increase G. G is a part of our aggregate demand, and then aggregate demand would shift out and we would reach our full employment equilibrium. How does this actually work though? If demand is low, if aggregate demand is low, our output is low, what do we have to do? Well, with fiscal policy, we're saying run a deficit. Why does that work? Why does running a deficit boost aggregate demand out? Well, what happens is, hey, the economy is not going very well. And if we run a deficit, what we're going to do is we're going to increase G without other changes going on. And we now have more government spending than revenue. We're moving more towards a deficit. With more G and not the taxes to offset it, we are moving towards a deficit. So we're going to increase G sum. And with the multiplier, aggregate demand kind of grows back and our output gets back to normal. We can also do this with a tax cut. We can move towards a deficit with a tax cut. If government spending stays the same, but now we have less revenue, we have a deficit. What that could look like is we're in a recession. Consumption and investment are low, and so our aggregate demand and hence our output are low. But we move towards a deficit with a tax cut. If we have a tax cut, but spending stays the same, we're moving towards a deficit. When you cut taxes, that allows for consumers to spend more. As consumers spend more with the multiplier effect, that will offset that drop in aggregate demand and then offset the overall drop in output. The multiplier makes changes in aggregate demand even larger, and so we can get back to normal. We can get back to our full employment level. And so we have two ways of moving towards a deficit and boosting aggregate demand out so that if we are in a recession, we get back to full employment. We could either increase government spending and keep tax revenue constant. That's moving towards a deficit. Or we could drop our taxes but keep government spending constant, and that moves us more towards a deficit, and that could boost aggregate demand out for us. But one thing we already said is that the primary tool of Keynesian fiscal policy is going to be to increase government expenditures when we have a recession present to boost aggregate demand out. So why don't we use the tax approach? There's two different approaches. We could increase government expenditures or we could drop taxes. So think about this for a second. Go ahead and pause the video and think, well, why might a benevolent Keynesian who's engaging in fiscal policy advocate for tax cuts? Why do we prefer government spending to these tax cuts, right? So why might a benevolent Keynesian fiscal policy advocate prefer government spending to tax cuts? Think about this one for a second. And now this all comes back to, how do these recessions occur in the first place? If we have animal spirits going on and people are maybe spooked in the economy, they might be just kind of stuffing money underneath their mattress. And so if we increase G, if we increase government expenditures to move towards a deficit, we will for sure get that money spent on the programs that we engage in. If we go to build a dam, hey, that money is going to be spent. But if instead we move towards a deficit, which is expansionary fiscal policy, right? If instead we do a tax cut, then what we're doing is we're giving the individuals out in the economy basically some extra money that they have. But if they're so spooked that they're not going to spend it anyway, basically all we're doing is returning some of their money so that they can stuff more of it underneath their mattress. So with a reduction in taxes to move us towards a deficit, people might sit on their money, but with government spending, it definitely gets spent. So fiscal policy Keynesians tend to favor increases in government spending when we're in a recession rather than dropping taxes, even though this is a theoretical possibility for us to drop taxes. So when an economy is operating below its potential output, the Keynesian model would suggest that the government should institute expansionary fiscal policy. We need to move towards a deficit to expand our aggregate demand. How do we move towards a deficit? We can increase government purchases of goods and services. We can increase G to move aggregate demand further out. Or we can cut taxes. And if we cut taxes, that allows for consumption to increase, which again moves aggregate demand further out. Another question for you. Why wouldn't we want to always use expansionary fiscal policy? This sounds great. Let's increase aggregate demand and increase output. Go ahead, pause the video and see if you can answer this question. If the economy is overproducing, inflation can be a potential problem. Booms can lead to inflation. If you use expansionary fiscal policy when your economy is already at its potential output, you're just creating booms or expansion in the business cycle that only create inflation and don't really increase output much. So we can see if we boosted aggregate demand out by using expansionary fiscal policy, what we get is a very little increase in output to equilibrium 0.3 here, and we get a pretty large increase in the price level. As this happens, we also have to note that even though the short-run aggregate supply curve is rather flat, on the left half of this graph, to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve, it's rather steep to the right half of this. And the economy has the self-corrective mechanism in the long run of the short-run aggregate supply curve adjusting around because of prices. And the Keynesians will later argue, even though it's not an emphasis here, that this process, it doesn't take very long for it to happen if we are on the right half of this graph. So if we are beyond full employment, we still get this adjustment process of our short-run aggregate supply curve. And so we might end up fairly quickly back at an equilibrium where we have short-run aggregate supply curve 2, and we're back to full employment. And so now what we've done is we've just created even more increase in the price level, and our output really just temporarily increased from YF to Y3, and that's just in the short run. So remember, there's no reason to expand aggregate demand when things are going well, as we cannot sustain a level of output past potential GDP. We can temporarily be at an equilibrium where our aggregate demand is too high in a well-functioning economy, but we can't sustain this. Inflation can happen quite quickly, and prices, they adjust pretty quickly in the upward direction. So when we're beyond our potential output, those prices, they go up pretty quickly. And so what we're going to end up with is very little increase in output and quite a bit of inflation. We also want to talk about the language that we're using here. In the previous example, we used expansionary fiscal policy. We expanded aggregate demand out. Here we have restrictive fiscal policy or contractionary fiscal policy. Restrictive fiscal policy moves aggregate demand back in. It restricts aggregate demand. It contracts it back theoretically to the long-run aggregate supply curve. Restrictive fiscal policy fights against these overexpansions of the economy. It is a reduction in government expenditures and/or an increase in tax rates, such that the expected size of the budget deficit declines, or we move more towards a surplus. How does this actually work? Well, we are in a situation where the economy is overheating. Let's say that consumption and investment are a little bit high, plus the multiplier effect leads to a really high aggregate demand and thus a really high level of output. We are worried about the long run effects of this. We're worried about the resource prices adjusting, the short run aggregate supply curve shifting back, and we get just inflation and no real benefit to our output. And so we want to counteract this. We want to move towards a surplus. Just like moving towards a deficit, a surplus can be achieved in a couple of ways. One way is by decreasing government expenditure without any other changes. So we now have less government spending than revenue, as the revenue has remained constant. If we decrease G and we have a multiplier effect, this will cause a rebalancing of our aggregate demand and pull our level of output back to our long-run aggregate supply potential output. Aggregate demand shrinks and we get back to normal. The other way is that if we're experiencing an economic boom and we want to do contractionary or restrictive fiscal policy, that we can move towards a surplus by allowing government expenditures to remain the same, but now bringing in more revenue by increasing our taxes. If we increase taxes, what happens is we lose money in terms of consumption, so C goes down. That filters through to aggregate demand via a multiplier effect and brings our output level back to normal. And so we have two different moves that take us to a surplus and create restrictive fiscal policy. We can either decrease G, government spending, or we can increase taxation and reduce our consumption. These are both used to combat potential problems that inflation can bring. Keynesian analysis suggests a shift toward a more restrictive fiscal policy by reducing government expenditures and/or raising taxes. If we face an economic problem like a recession, the Keynesian approach to fiscal policy says there's really kind of two routes that we can look at. One route is kind of the classical approach. We can wait for the self-corrective mechanism to work. So if we're in a recession, we just wait for lower price adjustments that come from lower resource prices, and thus the short-run aggregate supply curve eventually moves its way back out and we can restore full employment. But the Keynesians argue that's not always going to work and it might take a really long time to happen. So the second approach that we can look at is their suggested approach. The alternative approach: use expansionary fiscal policy to purposely stimulate aggregate demand and push the economy back out to full employment. Guide the economy back to equilibrium. Keynesian theory highlights the potential of fiscal policy as this tool that might be capable of reducing fluctuations in aggregate demand, and it might be able to boost aggregate demand if we are in a recession. This idea of making the business cycle a little bit more stable, that if we go too far out in our economy, if we have a boom, if we're beyond full employment, or if we are in a recession, a contraction, if we have a really high level of unemployment, that we could push the economy back towards full employment. This idea is counter-cyclical fiscal policy, that we counter the business cycle with fiscal policy. We use fiscal policy to push the business cycle up when it's too low, and we tamper it down when it's a little bit too high. Countercyclical policy is going to be very prominent in early Keynesian fiscal policy discussions, but we'll see that this is a really hard task to achieve. This is not something that we really have a grasp of. Following the Great Depression, though, Keynesians really challenged the idea that governments should always just balance their budget. Rather than just balancing their budget, Keynesians argued that government should use countercyclical policy. It should use the budget to counter the business cycle in order to offset these fluctuations in aggregate demand. We see that fluctuations in aggregate demand can happen in an economy, especially within the Keynesian worldview, where we can see, why is it that we get into a recession in the first place? How is it that aggregate demand could be bouncing around so much? And for that, we have to look back to the idea of animal spirits, the Keynesian beauty contest, and the multiplier effect. So this bouncing of the aggregate demand curve and the idea that fiscal policy can correct it, we're getting from this the idea that government could plan budget deficits when an economy is weak, and it could plan budget surpluses when an economy is really, really strong or kind of in a boom. If high demand threatens to cause inflation, move towards a surplus. If high unemployment and times are tough, then move more towards a deficit. Counter the business cycle. Do countercyclical fiscal policy. Move the economy in the opposite direction of the business cycle. If we're expanding towards a peak, tamp it back down. If our economy is below the trend line, bring it back up. They often say similar things to this when talking about sports. Don't let your emotions get too high nor too low. Maintain a consistent balance. That's kind of the approach here to Keynesian countercyclical fiscal policy. We'd like to do that with the economy. Don't let things get too high. Don't let things get too low. And how do we do that? Well, we move aggregate demand around with fiscal policy. All right, so that is Keynesian fiscal policy. We're using fiscal policy to counter the business cycle. We're using the federal budget as a tool to guide the macroeconomy. But it turns out that Keynesian fiscal policy is no cure-all. It might be important, but it's not so easy. To understand more about fiscal policy and see where macroeconomics heads, click on the video here.